I'm Adam. I work for the enterprise sales team here at Classy, and welcome to Why Hasn't Technology Solved Our Problems? We've been talking a lot this week about how technology is being leveraged to advance the missions of a lot of organizations in the social sector. A lot of times that's not enough. I mean, we're still dealing with a lot of the same social problems we were dealing with 30, 40 years ago. So we've brought up this panel of experts to talk not only about how they're leveraging technology to advance the missions of their partners faster, but also how they're filling the gaps when sometimes those technologies aren't enough. So I had a long list of accolades I was going to read off, and Joe said that it would take way too long with this particular group, and you guys aren't here to hear me talk anyway. So Joe Callahan's going to be our moderator, and Joe is our VP of Product and Design at Classy. We also have with us Masuma Henry, and she's the Executive Director at Artifact, which I'm sure you guys are all familiar with. We also have Dar Vanderbeck, who is the Chief Innovation Officer at CARE. And lastly, Elena Matsui, the Strategy Associate for the Rockefeller Foundation. So with that, Joe, I'll kind of leave it to you.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, everyone, for hanging out with us today for a discussion that I'm sure is going to be pretty exciting and informative. Welcome, ladies. Between the three of you, you got pretty impressive track record for using design and technology to solve social issues. Yet that we see today that technology sometimes falls flat in certain areas like education, healthcare, agriculture, microfinance, governance. So I think the goal of today is to just share some of our thoughts on why technology hasn't had as much impact as we'd like to see in some of these social issues, and how maybe we can better approach some of these problems to have more positive outcomes. So let's dive in. Question for everyone. I think we'll just start kind of general and high level. What are some of the challenges that come with designing for social good? Let's start with you, Masuma.
The biggest question possible to be asked. Some of the challenges, I think, designing specifically for social impact and the user base that we're designing for is that it's really hard to tell who's in power in this situation. So, for example, if you're dealing with youth homelessness as a population, it's really important to think about, who is influencing them, who is standing as barriers for them, and then who has access to resources that they don't have. So what it means as a designer is that you really have to design not only for them, but for the people who they're networking with and who stand in their way, so that you can remove barriers. And sometimes removing barriers is the best design you can do for a population.
My answer is a bit similar to that in terms of for whom we design and who decides what is social good. I think are two really key pieces. One of the things that I've appreciated of seeing the rise of human-centered design and just this embrace of design language into work about social change is that it edges on kind of anthropology, right? We start thinking about power, we think about systems, we think about intention and how little intention matters in a different way that's structured to become a process that is moving us forward to solutions rather than just kind of being crawling in exploration space. So I think that is something that I know we'll dive into later more in depth, but one of the biggest challenges that I see is kind of a more moral, a more kind of systems challenge, which is what is good, who designs it, and for whom.
That's great. So at the Rockefeller Foundation, we've had the same mission for over 100 years, which is to promote the well-being of humankind all over the world, which is extremely ambitious. And we do see technology as a strategic lever in pursuit of that very ambitious goal. But I think that it's really important to understand the difference between the technologies and the kind of amazing apps and gadgets and widgets that are coming out every day, some of which are really exciting, and to also think about things that are actually tech-enabled. So what do we mean by that? How can we actually think about the solutions and the outcomes that we're driving towards and really be quite clear about the values and about the outcomes that we're seeking. Are we seeking an equitable society with more inclusive economic opportunities for more people? Well, then I think it's important to think backwards and understand how can technology enable that future for us, rather than starting with the technology and trying to let technology drive our decision making and technology drive what those outcomes will really look like. So I think that's the real challenge, is something as designers that we need to be thinking about and really wanting to be purposeful and mindful about what are those values and end outcomes that we're seeking, rather than getting distracted and maybe going down a path that technology seems to lead us down, but perhaps is not aligned with those values.
That's great. Do you think, and now this is back at you, do you think that, is there a reason that we sometimes as a society look at technology as the go-to solution? Is it this kind of Silicon Valley way of thinking where jump onto the technology solution before really having an understanding of the beneficiary?
I mean, I think that there are amazing technologies out there, and to be fair, that is the future, right? I mean, I think that there are incredible opportunities out there, and it's easy to design a thing and a product. Yeah. It's hard to design a system that works for people who don't have a voice or a seat at the table. Right. And so I think that we often default to thinking about the thing or the product that is shiny and new and could have tremendous potential. But the real question is actually, how do you enable technology to be accessible and affordable and to actually drive the kinds of outcomes that you're looking for?
That's great. That's great. I'd love to dive into some war stories or some case studies about how maybe you've seen technology kind of flop. Would you like to start us with one, Masuma?
Sure. Anyone who works with technology, or really any kind of innovation space, whether it's process or systems or technology, knows that, you really get it wrong most of the time. And the goal is to learn from that failure and iterate. We were talking before about our war stories, and the one that I'll share with you guys today is we were designing a social networking platform. This is back when chatting and SMS was the primary way of social networking in closed groups. And it was with the vulnerable population in South Africa, youth who live in urban settings. We need to do some education about HIV and AIDS, given the kind of the high rates there. And sex is a taboo topic to speak about with family members. And so we designed this, closed network for youth that they could opt into and talk openly, to ask questions about condoms and safe sex. And what ended up happening is people did talk about sex, so that was great. We broke taboos. But also people started using it as a way to hook up with others because they were talking about sex with youth. And in hindsight, it seemed very, very, amazing that we didn't think about that, but it actually happened. And so we were able to learn from that and actually implement some other solutions, which we can get into later.
That's great. Dar?
I was first thinking of kind of blowing up the definition of technology, because I think we're implicitly treating it to be like things on our phones versus like the printing press. But unfortunately, I'm not old enough to have a cool story about using the printing press. So one of my favorite terrible stories is working with a partner who wanted to create a technology to combat gender-based violence in urban areas. And the solution was to have an app where anytime you felt sketchy, you would press a button that would give kind of a map that they could kind of communicate with local authorities to better police that region. I think you could probably already imagine the many ways in which this is an example of a good idea that has disastrous applications, but one of them being that it was only available on the newest phone. The second being available that who is saying what is sketchy. So essentially what happened was you have an app that accelerated racism, accelerated classism, and then paired it to local authorities to then further beef up policing. So that's a bad one.
Yeah.
Wow. So a couple years ago, we were looking at the issue of online work or micro work as a way to increase economic pathways for disadvantaged youth in Africa. And for those, I'm sure most of you already know what online work is, but it's essentially a way for employers to post usually small or medium tasks on online platforms, and for freelance workers to be able to kind of bid on those jobs. And so we saw this as an enormous opportunity to tap into a large pool of jobs for youth that maybe had high school training or less. What we saw was that youth were really excited, really interested in this opportunity. We did a lot of awareness raising campaigns. And what we weren't seeing, though, was youth being able to actually register on these platforms, and then the conversion rates to even, them then landing a job were really low. And what we learned was that there were a whole range of issues that were creating barriers between these youth being able to actually access these opportunities. One was around infrastructure. So we knew that the youth we were working with did not have access to high-speed internet or computers at home. We did expect that they would be able to access computers at internet cafes and community centers. What we did not expect was that these online platforms required registration with unique IP addresses. So if a youth was using a shared computer, they couldn't register on these platforms if someone else had been there and registered before. So that was a huge issue. We also saw that actually a lot of the employers who were posting those jobs were doing so, or were based in the West, and so were posting those jobs during the work hours that we keep here, 9 to 5. So a lot of the African youth that we were working with were just missing the window of being able to actually bid on those jobs at the right time, because they were all bid for and taken before they even woke up. So what we realized was that, this specific technology, while we thought was going to really explode the space in terms of economic opportunities, actually really needed to be adapted in ways to make it available and usable for our beneficiary group. And it wasn't just the technologies that needed to be adapted, but also the kind of holistic wraparound services that are available to underprivileged youth as well, so that they can access what can be a really amazing opportunity.
Interesting, yeah. So it seems that maybe some of the lessons learned would be preferred to know those up front or earlier on in some of these solutions. Thinking in retrospect of those 3 case studies, this is an open-ended question. How do we better approach situations or potential solutions like that, where we can learn earlier or get a quicker feedback loop on potential prototypes? Any new approaches from those situations?
This is it's not that interesting of a response, because I think we've all heard about rapid prototyping. That's a big thing that we're allegedly doing, all of us, all the time, right? I think what's interesting for me is putting that within an organization that is old, structured, bureaucratic. So how you find that space, I think it's what we know we should be doing is testing iteratively with whoever we define our users to be, but creating the regulatory space, creating the norms culturally within an organization is something that I think is much more difficult. I don't know, speaking, I work at CARE, we've been around for 71 years. There are we're 10,000 staff members, 94 countries, and that's part of what makes, and many of us all work for organizations like that. So how you adapt these principles into actual programming, actual kind of practice, I think is more of the sticky piece that does come down to leadership, culture, all of these things.
Yeah, I'll add to that. At Artifact, we're a consulting firm, human-centered design consulting firm. And so we have both the privilege to work with these wide span of clients, like the Gates Foundation, for example, who is really well known for innovation, really has a lot of kind of funding and power behind them. Smaller nonprofits, and then larger, older organizations like pharmaceutical companies. And a lot of our innovation comes right there when it comes to organizational kind of appetite. So you would think, being a design and technology firm, we would spend a lot more time actually designing the technology, but probably 50% of our engagements are actually spent kind of designing the process of bringing the leadership and the stakeholders on board to be open-minded, to learn how to think a little bit differently, to set up teams that are sustainable, so after we leave the engagement for 2 or 3 years, they can continue on with the piloting process. And it takes quite a lot of trial and error to figure out what works in an organization, because each organization has a different culture of experimentation and also data. Some, for example, really value storytelling as a result from piloting. Emotional stories, that's what convinces them. And then other ones really focus on rigorous quantitative data. And so you have to change your piloting approach to really think about the culture that is the audience.
Yeah, I just want to build on what you're saying. But I do think that that's, while being on the inside, it can be excruciatingly frustrating. It's also so important, right? Like, we're not all just robots that you kind of code and then we all start rapid prototyping. Like, part of that is the leadership development angle too.
I would add the kind of up and coming and very now popular realm of behavioral science as kind of another tool in your toolkit. So I think in some ways this complements, but also kind of takes human-centered design a few steps further in some ways. And so we've been prototyping the use of behavioral science in our work over the past couple of years. And I can share a really quick example from some work that we did where we partnered with a behavioral science firm called Ideas 42, and we wanted to better understand some challenges that we were seeing around the adoption of specific technologies within a smallholder farmer population. And so this was part of a big initiative that we had launched, looking at improving farmer livelihoods by reducing post-harvest loss and improving kind of crop yields. And so part of that initiative was actually to deploy and develop a lot of these technologies that were going to help farmers really kind of improve their livelihoods. And to kind of talk about a printing press example, one of the technologies was a bag. Like, we're talking plastic crates and bags here. So this bag was triple layered, so it could be hermetically sealed, so no air could get in or out. That means that when you put grains inside the bag, it doesn't rot, pests can't get into it, and you're seeing, maybe 5 to 10% loss of those grains, rather than traditionally what you were seeing of like 40 to even 70% of the grains being lost because of rot and pests. So we got so excited about this technology, and we wanted to get it out there to everyone. We did all these demonstrations and kind of trials so that people could understand what this was all about. And farmers were super excited about it, but when time came to actually purchase, the purchase orders showed that no one was buying, so no one was using these bags. And we thought, what gives? We don't understand what happened. And so we took a behavioral science lens to this problem to better understand how folks were making decisions. And what we learned was that there was what behavioral scientists would call kind of present bias that was driving short-term thinking here. So farmers might learn about these bags and get really excited and form an intention to buy them months before harvest. But then when harvest time came and they actually had to buy the bags, that's when they're most cash poor, right? And so they don't have that extra couple of cents to buy this bag that's slightly more expensive than the traditional kind of plastic bags that they were used to using. And so with that insight and really trying to unpack what are those behavioral bottlenecks that are creating decision pathways that might not create the outcomes that are best suited for our beneficiaries, we now are beginning to design different solutions that might sit outside of the technology itself, but enable that technology to be affordable and accessible. So we're thinking about layaway programs so that farmers can kind of put away a little bit each month so that they can buy the bags or have the bags on hand when harvest time comes. So I think it's a little bit of kind of digging into the personal experiences and specifically what drives decision-making and preferences throughout an entire process.
Do you mind if I add on that real quick? Please. Okay. Because it just reminds me, I think that another space that we're edging into, despite talking about scale all the time, is there is, especially in social justice world, international development world, we have so many pilots. We have all of these inventions, all of these interventions. This language we still use, but how we actually take those to a meaningful scale, I think, is something that at CARE really captures our imagination a lot. We have a program called Scale by Design that we just started, and part of it was to say, if we go back to Everett Rogers, right, like 1930s agriculture economist, and he talks about the difference between an invention and an innovation. And right now, I think we use the word innovation to mean those tiny little pilots that work at a place, rather than something that can actually change lives at scale. But how we do that, like how an organization can identify something that is a transformational, project or program, understand or unearth the inherent business model behind it, and then take that to scale. I think that's kind of the next area where I think every organization I go to and talk to, it's a collective interest or aspiration. We all talk about it, how we actually align to be able to do that. We start getting into knowledge management. We get into all these like heavier words and things, but I think that piece around, okay, you have something that works here. How do we actually have those levers to meet the need of today in this world is kind of uncharted territory.
That's interesting. More on scale, very buzzwordy, but I think a big challenge. So if we do solve for an individual or within research and we've validated that there's some value here, and now we're exposing it to a community and looking for adoption at a greater scale, if you will, how do we kind of validate that early at a bigger scale, and then how do we check back in? Like maybe it's working today. Any experience on coming back a month later or a year later and finding that maybe it's not working as well as we thought? And how do we stay ahead of that kind of learning curve? Any thoughts?
I could jump in again.
Yeah.
So with the Scale by Design, and I'm going to make this short because I realize this answer could be very tactical and boring, but Scale by Design program that CARE has been launching of let's have all of our best programs apply. We narrow it down to 15, and then they go through a curriculum. And part of that is this kind of experience called Designing for Scale. We've definitely been inspired by Malago and others as we developed of this. But it's really around, we have evidence that this works in this way. Let's think about all of the different available models for scale, from like viral replication to franchising models to maybe fee-for-service consulting models that are a little more custom, to just really strong partnerships, but doing the same old. And how we kind of put them all on these 3-month, 6-month checkpoints of like, how will you know, and then we get into the world of just kind of monitoring and evaluation really quickly, but not to make it heavy, just to say you have a specific team. We are trying to really vigorously get in at the design process around what core hypotheses we're going to test, and then we can iterate back there. So that's one way that we do it.
I'll add to that as well, that a lot of our clients will come to us with kind of the problem of scale, right? So we had this solution and it worked in Tanzania, but it didn't work in another country. Can you help us figure out why? And one of the big barriers I find, especially with nonprofit organizations who are kind of beholden to their grantors, is that their measurement and evaluation questions are determined up front. And so they don't have the freedom to basically say, maybe we're just asking the wrong question, or maybe we need to step back to the very beginning 3 years ago and say, what questions were we asking at that time? And so that's been some of our process with Scale, is to basically revisit questions and understand that the questions also can be piloted. So we often think about piloting solutions, and we'll have maybe short cycles, a month, 3 months, 6 months. But the question should be piloted from measurement and evaluation as well. So this idea of piloting, in my point of view, is that piloting is never really done. You're just basically piloting a new thing, process, or question.
I would just add, I think those are terrific answers. I would just add that we're constantly trying to understand how to solve today's problem, but also create the solution that will be adaptable enough to be able to be applied 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And that's the real challenge, right? How do you create something that can morph and be resilient to unpredictable situations that are absolutely going to happen? I mean, one tool that I think everyone knows about, but I would just give another kind of vote for, is scenario planning, and trying to think about what are unintended consequences that we might see if we were to play that movie forward, and how do we then design for that. So for example, there have been a lot of pilots where you've seen a lot of these new technologies that are kind of plastic water tanks that can collect water in urban areas so that you can kind of reuse this water for different uses. And they've been taken now to Africa and Latin America and Asia, and they've become basically cesspools for mosquitoes that then transfer dengue fever and all these other pathogens. So I think that someone didn't play that movie forward in a way that was able to understand what those unintended consequences might be, because we're going to need to kind of stay on our toes and continuously adapt and transform solutions. There's no just kind of thing that you can put out into the world and then leave it. So I think it takes a lot of dedication, and I think that that's a kind of a challenge for funders to stay dedicated and aware of kind of what their programs and kind of activities are doing, not just within the time period that they've grant termed, but even beyond that.
Interesting. So let's talk about approach. So the people in our audience are probably curious. So how can I look at my problem in a different lens? How can I reconsider it? How can I approach it in a different way? What are some of your suggestions or recommendations on how to look at your problem in a more human-centered way, looking at your beneficiary closer? How can we do a better job of that? Do you have any thoughts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one really practical tip I would add, along with Elena's scenario planning, is what we call relationship mapping. And it's it's a tool that's often used in systems design and human-centered design. But it's this idea of thinking about who's your beneficiary, mapping the people in their life that may help or hinder them from making decisions, and then really thinking about how is that relationship? Is it a strong relationship, a positive one, or is it broken? And it really helps you understand, again, who you want to design for. I'll give an example here. We were designing experience to help people navigate breast cancer. And when we did this relationship mapping, our client had decided to actually design the experience for the woman who is undergoing cancer. But what we discovered is that, it's often a male counterpart, a husband, it might be a brother, most often a husband, who's actually going through the procedure with her. And it's really them that doesn't actually have any good solutions built for them. They don't know how to be supportive or navigate the journey, understand when to be the husband and when to help make decisions, for example, for the family. And so it was actually really great in that it helped reframe who the user was and really think about an underserved audience for that scenario.
Just double click on that, but I also want to make a note of, just because I do believe language matters. Do we have anyone from Oxfam in the crowd by any chance? Probably not. Okay. They do this really well. So something, we still use this word beneficiary, which I think if we're applying human-centered design to our own selves, thinking of who we designed for as what the word beneficiary means of like a recipient is really problematic. And one of the things that Oxfam does, and I really admire them for, are very diligent about talking about primary change agents. And I do think that subtle shift actually does change. I'm designing for the primary change agent, and thus that makes me a tertiary change agent, or whatever that might be. But as we think about applying some of these principles to even how we have this discussion.
Good point.
Yeah.
So I know that human-centered design has kind of been the darling of international development and programming for a while now, and I think there are tremendous assets that HCD brings to the table. But I also think that we should remind ourselves that it comes from the private sector and was initially used to support product design. And so thinking about kind of who is at that center of what you're designing for is really important. And I would say that one of the things that I've found quite challenging in my work when I'm applying a human-centered design lens is thinking about this emphasis, and I would consider it an overemphasis on the user. And it seems extremely myopic, given the fact that we know we need to take a systems perspective, and we have to understand the power dynamics in a systems and stakeholder map. And any program that we're designing, it's going to include myriad stakeholders, from policymakers in government to civil society organizations, the NGOs, communities, women, elders, youth. So who's the user when you're designing for something that needs to take all of these different perspectives into account? So I think one thing that I've tried to do is to kind of explode that idea of what the user is, and really try to think more about what are the incentives that are driving decisions, and that might impede behavior change in different ways, rather than trying to really focus in on a particular user at any given time, because I think that can be quite limiting.
That's a great point. And to follow up on that, a question for you. So if we have multiple users in different scenarios, how do we, as people looking for solutions, how do we kind of validate potential prototypes or solutions early on if there's so many stakeholders in the game?
Want to start? Okay. I'll take a stab. So I think one of headline, no silver bullets, right? I think that's something that we can all agree on. And I think some of the lexicon we use to describe creating solutions starts to feel like we're creating a widget that's going to be like that Indiana Jones moment. And rather than saying, no, this isn't, this diagnosis, this isn't penicillin we're creating, but looking at a whole human system. And so one of, I think there's this Karl Popper, I'm sure many of us are familiar with it, but talking about the difference between clouds and clocks. He talks about emergent systems, and we treat things like clouds like they are clocks. So we think about a society, and we're thinking about issues like social justice, right? And we still expect, if we are able to treat it as a clock, take it apart into its component parts, fix the one or make it better, put it back, and then that's how it should work. We have a kind of philosophical problem in our approach of how we think about the deeply contextual and fluid organism that is, human groupings. So I think that, just to your point, to both put a point on it, but also potentially make it even more abstract, is this issue of saying a lot of the language, a lot of the philosophical approaches we're using, this conversation around solutions, leaves out the key piece of human ownership, of leadership, of our experience of that. And we have some threads, experience design, et cetera, but I haven't really seen it yet pulled together in a coherent theory and praxis.
Okay. So back to another private, maybe software development slang: fail fast, fail forward, fail often. Do you think that applies to social impact design? And if so, or if not, why? Masuma?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what we can learn from the software development approach is this idea of iteration and learning from failure. I think that this idea of lean startup and all the popularity around it has opened up minds, and it's opened up minds of large traditional organizations. So that part I love. I think that's where product development has had a huge, huge impact on every part of business culture. I'm not so sure that failing fast applies, though. When I think about the timescales of software development, for example, you might fail fast within a 1 month cycle, 2 month cycle. And when it comes to really wicked, complex problems, the cloud problems, it's really hard to assess what's going on. There's no uptake in the bag, but you really have no clue why. And figuring out that why takes a really long time, and it takes patience. And so I think maybe just the timelines, there needs to be patience for the timelines being different, and also to be running multiple experiments at the same time, not thinking about first we'll do this A, B, then this B, C, but it's really A1 versus B2, B3 versus C1, all at the same time, so you can start, if you want to go fast, you can start collecting that data.
Yeah, I'll just build on what you said. I think that there is, as practitioners, a call to really balance a sense of or real humility with like the ferocity of like the urgency of now kind of thing. And I think that this idea that we would be able to fail fast in undoing millennia of like patriarchy, let's just go for it and say it. Like that is, yeah, it's crazy. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be most rigorously and ferociously going after what we think might disrupt the enabling environment that creates unjust power systems. So I think it is a balance from the systems perspective, but also as a practitioner.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that it's also a question of what failure for whom and of what, right? So I think when we talk about prototyping, we've been trying to think about it as kind of paper prototyping, which means that we have to be quite thoughtful and careful about managing expectations, about what it actually means to go out and test in communities where we might or may not actually end up deploying a specific intervention. So I think it really has a lot to do with the fact that I'm okay if I fail, and I'm okay if the foundation on some level fails, but I'm not okay if something fails out in a community that we're trying to help, right? So I think how can we de-risk as funders and as practitioners in responsible ways? So how can we take on that burden while we're trying to think more quickly about some of these wicked problems, but how can we shoulder that rather than kind of putting it all out there for others to feel the pain?
Yep, that's great. So to follow up on risk and risk mitigation, impact assessment, any best practices? I know you have a ton of experience in that, Elena.
Do I?
You do.
Well, I mean, I think that for us at the foundation, I think it's really important for us to think about being risk-tolerant capital and wanting to give our grantees and our partners the room to be able to explore and surface new and innovative technologies and solutions. I think that we rely on the expertise and the just amazing knowledge base that exists outside of the foundation to help us check ourselves and to keep our feet on the ground and do some ground truthing when it's necessary. And what that requires is being open to criticism and having open feedback loops, as we talked about before, to really make sure that we're hearing the critical voices, not just remaining in our own echo chambers, right? And so wanting to find those new places and populations who can tell us that this potential solution is going to fail because of X, Y, and Z, and being open to taking that criticism and incorporating that and informing that into our designs.
I think as a rule, something that I don't think it works perfectly, but whoever has the most power shoulders the most risk, or should. And that's something that's actually extremely subversive. From the James Baldwin idea of it's extremely expensive to be poor to what we see in our work, I keep doing that, sorry, is this idea, that the smallest holder farmer, the person that's growing the vegetables on their family farm and feeding their 8 children, that is who is shouldering all of the risk in many agriculture systems, as a small example. So I think that there's a real radicalness to your question about how we think about who bears what risk that I don't really know the answer to. But.
Okay, so I think we have time for maybe one more question that maybe we can all answer. Well, not me, 3 of you. What's like a half crazy prediction in the next 5 to 10 years in a cause sector that you think has the approach from like a technology standpoint hasn't been spot on? What's a cause sector that you think has the most opportunity for change if that approach is done correctly?
So I can jump in. I'm not sure I have a good answer to this one, but so we know that technology is going to be evolving in ways that we cannot predict, and we're going to be along for the ride, whether we like it or not. I mean, I think one really interesting example of something that we should be thinking more about, and I know a lot of people are, is blockchain. So I would say that this is a really interesting opportunity that, I mean, we see a ton of investment, over $1 billion on like fintech applications and things like that, but it's relatively nascent in the development space. I think there's huge opportunity for us to get in at the ground level now so that we can understand how you can leverage this really amazing opportunity for social good. I think that we see a lot of thinking around this now, but what I think will be really important is for us to, kind of echoing back to my first comment, around kind of the values and the principles and the ethics of how we're going to use this in a way that actually will improve lives rather than create privacy issues or other things. So I think that it's really important for us to kind of keep our eye on the prize of what kind of world do we want to see? We want to see a more equitable world. Well, then how can we leverage this, what I think is going to be a really powerful new technology towards that?
That's great.
To build on that with blockchain, I'm also really excited about blockchain technology and specifically the area of accreditation. So right now what's happening with this unprecedented kind of amount of displaced people all over the world is you have these people who are moving and basically don't get to take their papers or accreditation with them. So even in pretty educated areas like Syria, right, if someone was a dentist, when they move to Canada, if they get to move to Canada or US, they don't actually get to take any of their education with them, and so they have to prove all over again, usually going back to high school, which is pretty insane. Imagine if you're like a 45-year-old professional, you know English, you know the country, the language of the country that you're in, and then you have to go back to high school to get a diploma to start school. It's insane. And that's actually what happened in my family background. My family were refugees to Canada. And so this area of being able to take your credits with you and have them pass borders and not have them be on your person that can be taken by the military, it's what usually happens in the middle of the night when you have to leave your stuff. I think that's super, super exciting.
That's hard. That's a really hard answer to top. We should, let's collaborate and figure out a way to do that. I would love to get ahead of that. The first thing that came to my mind was this kind of birthing of a more global human rights movement, or at least a discourse on human rights. I think about in the United States right now, and speaking as someone that grew up in the United States, in a lot of ways we've been bought and sold this narrative that we don't have very much to learn from the rest of the world, especially the global South. And I think there are many reasons that point to right now where that is clearly not true. And that, in fact, PSA, the US is part of the rest of the world. And so thinking about, how movements, especially more liquid, more fluid, groups of people that are responding to an injustice can be connected across borders is something that, I'm really excited about. That's something that, there are many applications for technologies to advance it. It speaks, though, to the dire need to create some sort of ethical standards for the use of technologies. I think we're in this, it's such a nascent field that we don't have the equivalent of what a do no harm really looks like in practice. So I would say, those two things I think are what I'm thinking around or ahead of the curve.
I like it.
Yeah.
I like it. Well, cool. We have about 13 minutes left, but we'd like to open it up to the audience. If anyone has any questions for the group up here, we'd be happy to answer them. Can't really see.
Hi, thanks everybody. Fascinating panel. I think it's more about has innovation solved our problems than technology. That's really seems to be the discussion. My name is Lena and I work with Search for Common Ground. Wicked problems and all of these challenges. Now, a comment and a question. The comment is that just on the last part of your conversation, technology will reflect who we are. So it will unite and divide us, and it will both progress and impede equitable societies. And I think sometimes we think and pretend that we can actually control that. We can't, right? So let's just accept that and then just continue to navigate within that interconnected wicked problem. My question is, you made a comment, Elena, about the feedback loops and how Rockefeller Foundation tries to assume some of the risk. However, in this space of trying to use either technology or innovation to solve social problems, many other donors don't want to assume that risk. And because they have constituencies and because they have political objectives, and I know, CARE, you get some of your money from those kinds of donors as well. I just wondered, what are your thoughts, and have you seen any efforts that have worked to highlight the risk of not being ready to take on that risk by those certain donors and the failures that they are insisting on continuing to have because they're failing to take on that risk of learning and innovation?
No, it's a great comment and a very good and pointed question. I think we're in a very privileged space to be able to take on that risk, and I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to join kind of philanthropy as a sector, because I was really interested in understanding how private philanthropy in particular can really drive that de-risking piece that you talk about so eloquently. I think that where we can do better is by bringing partners to the table earlier who may not be able to take on that risk, and going on that journey together with them so that when time comes to actually pass off, so that others can not only take on risk but actually do the scaling, which we are not capable really of doing, honestly. We can actually have an aligned perspective on what the future should look like and understand the different roles that need to be played around the table. I'm not sure if I'm seeing a lot of progress around this, but I do think that we are seeing more and more commitments to collaboration, and I'm not just pitching the conference, but we are seeing more and more of these kind of collaborative partnerships where folks are understanding who can take on this piece of risk, who can take on this piece of risk, who can take on the scale, who can do that, and so then trying to kind of create a sum that's larger than larger than its parts. So I think that that's part of the answer, but it's one of the trickier things to do in the development space for sure.
Yeah, I would just add, as CARE, as you noted, takes on a lot of public funding, is that there's, maybe, and I think that this narrative has really shifted in the last 10 years, actually, in terms of going from educating our donors to a conversation of we are all humans reacting to the world that care about similar things. How do we evolve our relationship in relation to, as you say, a very fluid and changing world? I think it's interesting. I've seen in the last year more than for a while this conversation of you can't be neutral on a moving train, right? And technology has a really pointed and challenging role within that. When we say all the new hot technologies are somewhere between neutral and amazing, the next best thing, right? We celebrated Twitter in Tahrir Square in Egypt, but then said, oh, it's just a neutral platform in the 2016 US election. And I think that is starting to bring us along on this conversation of evolving our understanding of neutrality, evolving our understanding of what the risk of not acting, the risk of not baking your values into the design of a product, but also doing that with the design of your organization. So that's veering a little bit to the left of your question, but I do feel like we are at a moment where that conversation is shifting.
Hi, good afternoon. Hello? Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Tanya. I serve a multinational global education organization called the International Education and Resource Network. And we work through the medium of what's called virtual exchange and collaboration with young people. And I was just wondering, I believe it's going to be the next great educational disruptor because it expands equity and access around, Dar, what you said about more of a global dialogue around human rights and participation in the global South. I was wondering if any of you are doing global virtual collaboration in your work at present with young people, because you've talked about the amazing projects you're doing with farmers and gender-based violence, but I'm just wondering if you're working with young people, because I believe this kind of work is going to help with anti-radicalism and among other things. If people get to know one another, why would they want to kill each other, right? If they love each other. Anyway, just a thought. Thank you.
Yeah.
We're not, but I would love to hear more. It sounds incredible. I think that's exactly right, though. The whole issue is that we're seeing all of these new technologies and apps and things proliferate every day, and some of them are really doing great things. But again, the real question is, how are we going to ensure that equitable access to educational services is available to those who really need them? And I think that we need to understand the enabling factors that will create the connectivity and the space for that to happen, rather than having kind of these standalone kind of services here and apps here. So I think that's where things need to converge towards. So I commend you for that.
Yeah, I would just add that we do a bunch of young people work, especially remotely, in connecting, but don't do it systematically. So I would actually love to talk about what you've learned and what the insights are from that. I think that the implications are enormous, from actual programming work to just like flying places and going to meetings, which it's amazing that it's still such a huge pain point of, how do you kind of get in-person learning and dialogue when you all can't be in the same physical space. So I think that there's a lot to learn from that. Thank you for your comment.
Yeah, we're currently working on a program with Arizona State University around building a platform for sub-Saharan African youth to engage in each other around special topic areas. And what's been really interesting from a design perspective is that designing for this community has been quite different from designing from other communities, in that they're youth, so we have to be sensitive of just some of the conversations that take place and what we allow, what we moderate and what we don't. But it's also interesting that it's, sub-Saharan Africa is this huge place, right? And it's totally diverse with lots of different cultures, and we kind of put it into one cluster. And so all of these issues have come up on the platform. For example, religious differences, a lot of gender equity issues. And from a design point of view, we've tried to iterate the design of the system to actually intervene. So an example is, what we first found is that a lot of the women, even though we had 50-50 women and men on the platform, the women weren't participating. And so what we had to actually do was actually get 70-30 women on the platform, cherry pick women who would actually participate as community moderators, make sure that they had pictures to show that they were women, so other women would participate and say, okay, well, this is someone like me. And then we specifically had to ask certain men to tone their conversation down. And so we're finding that when it comes to specific groups like this, that the actual design of even like a specific button or a feature, how big the headspace is, it really matters. And that's been really fun to look at the analytics and kind of A/B test from that perspective.
Any other questions? Adam?
Going back to what was said earlier about risk mitigation for and by donors, how do we reframe that conversation to allow them to get involved and invest in innovation, even if it is riskier, but looking at that as an opportunity to eventually advance the mission much further?
The powers of persuasion. No, I think that there is something to be said, though, around, we're building a little moonshots department at CARE right now, and part of it is how do we kind of create a smaller fund to identify where there are areas that we believe, we could take a bit of a venture approach, but could be real catalytic. So we're actually thinking about blockchain and application, doing a pilot in Egypt right now. Not on accreditation, interestingly enough, so I am very interested in this. But part of in building that fund was around a sense of we all don't know the answers. We do know that we're in a moment of radical, exponential technology, total disruption, et cetera, et cetera. And we do need more mechanisms if we're really going to achieve our mission, which we presume we're all bought into, to be able to achieve that. And so I think that I would be really interested on the donor side of the table, how this comes across to you. But for our side, it's a lot of changing our tone as an INGO a little bit, right? It's not like, we have all the answers, here's a very elegant grant proposal. It's like, we're in this together now. How do we both share the risk? We bring the expertise, you bring this kind of type of capital, and then let's explore these spaces together. but it's, this is like for CARE, at least the last like 6 months of us, really deciding that this was an organizational priority.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a matter of understanding what are a couple of different options. One being, how can you create outsized impact by taking a riskier path, potentially? And trying to build that value proposition up in a way that really actually resonates for the decision makers who are really going to actually make the call, to be really candid about it. I think that's actually something that we've seen. Actually, we work a lot with private sector to understand how to build that business case for private sector folks so that they can shift their behavior in different ways. And part of the strategy there is finding your champion and getting meetings with that person who then can translate that up the food chain to actually get stuff done, right? So some of it is that, but it very much is around creating the value proposition and having your 5-point kind of talking point speech, right? Where you can be really clear about why this is better than something else and what is that ROI, right? And I think that just to be really, it's unfortunate, but it's true. I mean, just to understand why this ROI is better than something else. So just being really clear and getting your evidence base set up to be able to do that is really important.
Great. Well, sadly, we're out of time, but thank you everyone for joining us and for your interest in this topic. How about a big round of applause for our panelists? Now, don't go too far. We have our closing speech and address right after this, but thanks for everyone for coming.